Hello biology students, and welcome to this video where we're going to be discussing the circulatory system, which is also called the cardiovascular system. Now on this slide you can see there's a picture of a heart, which is the main organ that we're going to be discussing as part of this body system. Okay, so first let's talk a little bit about the functions of the circulatory system. So in order for an animal to have a circulatory system, it's usually because they have a body that's really large or complex, and therefore it's not possible to get all molecules and all materials to all cells in the body using diffusion alone. It would just take too long. So when bodies get large and complex, you need a circulatory system to transport things around the body. Some of these things that might get transported include things like oxygen gas, carbon dioxide gas, nutrients that cells need to function, waste they need to remove, and any other materials cells might need. So a second function of the circulatory system is that it actually helps to regulate body temperature. So this might seem a little surprising to you, but I want you to think how you look when you get really cold or when you get hot. So for example, when you're cold, the tips of your fingers will often turn white. And the reason that happens is because your blood vessels are constricting, which means they're bringing themselves deeper within your body. This means you have less blood flow to your body's surface, which means you're losing less heat from your blood to the surrounding environment. Conversely, when you get really hot, you tend to turn red. And this is because your blood vessels will actually dilate, which means they kind of get a little bigger and get closer to the surface of your body, which means you have increased blood flow to the surface of your skin, which means you are losing heat, which helps to cool you down. Finally, a third function of the circulatory system is that they also carry white blood cells. And white blood cells are a special type of cell that help to protect the body from disease, so it has a small immune function as well. Okay, so the circulatory system itself actually has two parts. It has what's called the cardiovascular system. I use the term cardiovascular system as a synonym for circulatory, but technically it's only part of the circulatory system. And that includes things like blood vessels, which are the arteries and veins that blood travels through, and the heart itself. I also want you to be aware that the circulatory system also includes what's called the lymphatic system, and this mainly functions in the immune system, and it includes things like lymph nodes, which you may have heard of, lymph vessels, and lymph, which is a fluid. We're not going to talk about that too much this year, but just know it exists, and it's technically part of the circulatory system. Okay, so let's talk about the heart a little bit. So we saw before that the heart is the central organ of the cardiovascular system, and it has a lot of important parts. And the heart is really vital to keeping blood moving throughout the body. So here's the picture of the heart here, and we're going to look at this structure more detailed on the next couple of slides. So some basic vocabulary about the heart is the heart is actually surrounded by a thin sac, like a tissue, which you can see in this picture here that's being held up by this knife. And that protective sac helps to protect the heart, and it's called the pericardium. Similarly, the heart itself is actually a giant muscle. So here, in this picture down here, the heart is cut in half, and you can see this thick layer of muscle is what actually allows the heart to contract. And that thick layer of muscle is called the myocardium. And as that muscle contracts, it helps to pump blood throughout the circulatory system, and the blood carries all those things that are being transported to cells that our cells need. Okay, so kind of a fun fact, an average heartbeat is 72 times per minute. Each beat pumps 70 milliliters of blood. So therefore, if you took all of the blood that was pumped by your heart in 1 year, it would actually fill up an entire Olympic-sized swimming pool, which means the heart is working really hard all the time. So you should be very thankful for your heart because it's doing a lot of work. Okay, so now let's break down the parts of the heart a little bit. So the first thing I want you to know is that the heart is sort of symmetrical. It has a left side and it has a right side. Now, with all anatomy, whenever we're talking about the right or left side of something, we're always referring to that person's right or left side. So if you can imagine that if this heart were in a body, the right side would actually be our left and the left would be our right. So everything on this side right here is being referred to the right side of the heart, and everything on this side is referred to the left. Now, the piece of muscle that divides the left side from the right side is called the septum. It's this part right here, okay? And then the heart itself has 4 chambers. It has 2 chambers on top, here and here, and 2 chambers down below. The upper chambers are called atria. Atria is the plural. The singular for that is atrium. And then these chambers receive blood from other parts of the body. And then the ventricles, the two chambers down below, are the lower chambers, and they receive blood from the atrium and actually pump the blood out to other parts of the body. So the atria receive blood, and the ventricles send blood out of the heart. And we'll see more about that in a little bit. Okay. So one way to remember this is, I think, if you draw a little cartoony picture of a heart, super cute, the ventricles are down bottom because V's fit into the point of the heart, where the atria are up top because the nice curvy part of the A kind of fits in the curvy part of the heart. If that helps you remember it, you can use that little memory trick. Okay. So the way the heart works is the left atria and ventricle kind of function as one unit, scratch that. The two atria kind of function as one unit, and the two ventricles function as one unit, which means the atria are going to pump at the same time, and the ventricles are going to pump at the same time. And again, we will look more into that pumping mechanism in a little bit. Okay, so separating the atria from the ventricles, at the entrance to the atria and the entrance to the ventricles and the exit of the ventricles, there are these things called valves. And valves are basically flaps of tissue that help to control blood flow. It helps keep blood flow in one direction. And basically the way they work is there's a little valve, for example, right here where I'm drawing, and when the atria contract, it will push the valve open so blood is able to flow this way, but when the atria relaxes again, that valve closes. So they're kind of like one-way doors. So the two valves right here and right here that are between the atria and the ventricles, they are called the atrioventricular valves. Atrio meaning atria, ventricular meaning ventricles, so the name makes sense. They're preventing blood from flowing backwards into the atria. The one on the right side of the heart is called the tricuspid valve, and the one on the left side of the heart is called the bicuspid valve, or the mitral valve. The only difference between the two is the number of flaps they have. So the tricuspid valve has 3 flaps, the bicuspid valve has 2 flaps, but they perform a very similar function. Okay, so there is a second set of valves that the heart also has called semilunar valves, and they are the valves that are located at the ends, at the exit points of the ventricles. So if we look here, we have what's called the aortic valve. And you can see the way blood is going to flow is the blood's going to flow in from the atria into the ventricle, and then it's going to go out the ventricle this way. So this aortic semilunar valve is preventing blood from going backwards into the ventricle once it's left. It's called the aortic semilunar valve because this portion of the heart right here is called the aorta. So it's named for where the blood is glowing. So to kind of summarize, that valve is preventing blood flow between the left ventricle and the aorta. So then, similarly, there's a second semilunar valve located on the other side of the heart, and that valve is called the pulmonary valve, and this prevents blood from going back into the right ventricle. Again, the blood's going to come into the heart this way, go into the ventricle, and then this valve right here prevents blood from flowing backwards. It's supposed to be flowing in that way I'm drawing my arrow, and it's called the pulmonary valve because this vessel right here is called the pulmonary artery. So now let's kind of talk the normal way that blood is supposed to move through the heart. So the first thing that's going to happen is that you're going to have blood that's lacking oxygen. The oxygen has already been used by cells. So that deoxygenated blood is going to enter the heart so it can be pumped to the lungs. It's going to enter the heart through a vessel called the vena cava, which is the biggest vein in your body. Deoxygenated blood from the top half of your body is going to come in via the superior vena cava, superior meaning top. And deoxygenated blood from the lower half of your body is going to come in through the inferior vena cava. But both of these vesicles dump into the same place. They dump into the right atrium, right here. From there, the blood is going to go into the right ventricle. Okay. And then from there, blood is going to be pumped. After the ventricle contract, blood is going to be pumped into the pulmonary arteries, okay? Now the pulmonary arteries, these are vessels that will bring blood to the lungs, and when blood goes to the lungs, the blood will be able to pick up oxygen, okay? It's going to drop off any carbon dioxide that's in the blood, and it's going to pick up oxygen. So now the blood is oxygenated. So from there, the blood is going to return from the lungs on both sides of the heart, because remember, you have 2 lungs. It's going to return via this structure called the pulmonary veins, which are right here and right here. And these structures are going to dump blood into the left atrium right here. From there, the blood will go into the left ventricle. And then finally, if you notice, the muscle on this part of the heart is really, really thick. And that's because this muscle needs to contract really strongly because it has to send the blood out the aorta, which is the largest artery in the body. And then now that oxygenated blood goes to all the cells in your body. So that muscle needs to be really strong and contract really strongly in order to get the blood all the way to circulate all the way out throughout the entire body. So to kind of summarize, we have blood coming in via the inferior and superior vena cava into the right atrium, where it goes down to the right ventricle and out the pulmonary artery, where we go to the left and right lung. Blood returns via the pulmonary veins. After being oxygenated, goes into the left atrium, left ventricle, and then out the aorta to the top half of the body, up this way, and the bottom half of the body, down that way. Okay, so now from there, the blood is going to travel through what are called blood vessels. So these are all the tubes that carries blood throughout the body. The human circulatory system is what's known as a closed system, which means blood is contained within the heart and blood vessels. There's not just blood floating around in all your tissues around your cells. It's in very specific locations. And these blood vessels help to form a vast network to help blood flowing in one direction, not just floating around randomly. Okay, so once leaving the heart, blood will always travel through kind of the same order of vesicles. It always goes from the biggest artery, the aorta, to smaller arteries, and then to little tiny arteries called arterioles, then capillaries, and then back to the heart via small veins, which are called venules, and then larger veins called veins, and finally the largest vein called the vena cava. So arteries always carry blood away from the heart. And because blood has a very high pressure at this point, because it just left the heart, it generally flows in surges. Arteries have elastic walls that help them to expand and contract as blood surges through them because the pressure is very high. And all arteries, except for the pulmonary artery, carries oxygen-rich blood. Because remember, the pulmonary artery is going to the lungs, which is why the blood is not oxygenated at this point. But all other arteries have oxygenated blood. So from the artery, you can kind of imagine the artery branches off into smaller and smaller branches, and eventually when you get down to really small branches, we call those arterioles. And then finally, the smallest branches we call capillaries. In fact, these branches are so small that they're only 1 cell thick. And because they're only 1 cell thick, they're thin enough to allow diffusion between blood and interstitial fluid, which is the fluid surrounding cells. So here we can have things like oxygen diffusing out of the blood vessels into cells. We can have carbon dioxide leaving your cells and going into your blood. We can have nutrients diffuse out of the blood into cells. Because it's so thin, this can happen. So here's a picture of an actual capillary. So you can see here's my teeny tiny 1 cell thick capillary. You can see a red blood cell fits nicely in it. And then these are all the cells of a muscle. So you can see, oxygen could diffuse out, CO2 could diffuse in, nutrients could diffuse out, waste could diffuse in, all of those things. The gas exchange and nutrient exchange happens at the capillary level. So this could happen via many mechanisms. You can get leakage of nutrients and gases through little openings called clefts in the capillary walls. This could happen via diffusion or osmosis. If blood pressure is high enough, it could force things out of the capillaries and into cells, or it could happen via endo and exocytosis. So then finally, once all the good things have been dropped off at cells and all the waste have been picked up, the deoxygenated blood now travels through small veins called venules, and then those small veins pool together into bigger vessels called veins, and then veins always return blood back to the heart. The blood pressure in veins is really, really low at this point because it was a long time ago that the blood was pumped out of the heart. It's lost a lot of its pressure. So most veins are actually sandwiched between skeletal muscles. And whenever you move, whenever you wiggle, whenever you walk, whenever you breathe, those muscles will pinch veins together and help squeeze blood towards the heart because you don't really have a lot of blood pressure at this point. Now, you can kind of imagine that once your muscle squeezes, once that muscle relaxes again, the blood will just fall back down through once you lose the pressure. So therefore, veins have valves in them that help to catch the blood each time your muscle relaxes. So you can kind of imagine, you're walking and the muscles will squeeze your veins, pushing the blood towards your heart. And then when it relaxes, the blood tries to fall backwards again, but this valve will catch it. Okay, so this happens either via movement or even things like breathing in your chest helps to also move blood through veins as well because it's also putting pressure on them. So here's a picture showing you that. You can see, so when your muscles are contracting, it helps to push blood up towards the heart, and when it's relaxed, the valves help to catch it. Okay, so to kind of summarize, here's the heart here. Here's my cartoony picture. Blood will leave the heart with oxygen via arteries and go to arterioles, and then capillaries, where gas exchange happens. And then the deoxygenated blood goes through venules and veins back to the heart to be pumped to the lungs to get more oxygen. So that's it for the circulatory system video, and I will see you in the next one.